So the crown I'm going to be making in this video is essentially part of a larger build I've been posting on the channel. It made more sense to make it a singular video because it was a longer process for that build, but it complements that project. This is custom crown I'm making for, like I said, another project in my shop. The design of this came directly off of plans. It's a custom style and it had to be made in mahogany, so it was something I couldn't source elsewhere. I had to make it in the shop. So as you can see, I made a plywood piece based off the dimensions. I can get the rough size I needed for width was about 3 1/4, and I just ripped a bunch of boards for that. Now you'll notice for this build I'm using a lot of smaller pieces, and that is because I was trying to use up scrap for this. Like I said, this is all mahogany, so it's an expensive lumber, and I didn't want to have to order extra. So I made a bunch of this out of about 16-inch pieces and one longer strip. It made for a little bit of a longer process on my end, but like I said, I was able to use up some scrap. So this is basically what I started with, a bunch of smaller pieces. I wouldn't necessarily say crown is my Achilles heel, but if I'm going to make mistakes when installing something, it's most likely going to be on crown because it is a particular process and I honestly just don't do it a lot. So you can see my stack was quite large. It was almost double the amount I needed because this takes long enough to make. If I made a miscut, having to go back and remake this would have been a nightmare because everything's set up for cuts of all these angles, and redoing that would just be a pain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by cutting these 3 outside angles on my table saw. The safest way to do this, because you can see the blade is tilted, so I couldn't use my 0 insert cover for the blade, was I have a piece of wood that rides on top of my fence that's connected to the mahogany so that it can't lower. You'll see once this is cut, there's really nothing connecting this piece to the top of the table saw, so it being held to that plywood makes this a much safer cut. I made a short of this and posted it on a couple social media platforms, and everybody kept telling me to watch my fingers, and I think it's because you couldn't see that safety piece in the video. My hands are quite far away from the blade in all of these. It might look closer just because of the deceptive depth perception of the camera, but be well aware of the fact that my fingers aren't as close to the blade as they look. So basically, like I said, the process in the beginning is quite simple. I'm just cutting the measurements of all of these pieces. You can see I put all of the degrees on there. I'm not going to get hugely into depth of the degrees of this particular piece because it is a custom piece. The process is something that people might learn and use in their own shop, but you won't necessarily be reproducing this exact same crown. It's not a common style. Once I had all those, you could see there's essentially 2 steps in this crown, so that when it's held up flat, they're square, but as I'm cutting it, they're at an angle. So the easiest way to do that was to remove it bit by bit on the table saw. Multiple people also in those shorts mentioned a router. You can recreate stuff like this on a router, but number one, you're going to need a bunch of specialty bits that I don't have, and I think the last time I made custom crown in the shop was probably 6 years ago. It's not something I do often. I didn't want to shell a bunch of money into router bits, and all of these pieces have to be cut at angles. I don't have a tilting top on my router bit, so the simplest way for myself to do it in my shop with the tools I have was on the table saw. And you could see it was just a process of it's the same angled tilt, and I'm just moving it's essentially just angled curve cuts I'm cutting into this. I have to lower the blade after each cut because the angle gets gradually more shallow as it approaches the table. So you can see at some point I'll gradually approach the blade, like on this cut, and I'll slowly lower it until it meets my line, and then I could send it all the way through. So like I said, it's just a basic series of curve cuts. It's pretty simple, just moving the fence over about 1/8 of an inch at a time. You could see this piece I sent through the wrong way. Stuff like that happens all the time in my shop. That was an easy fix. I just filled it with a piece of mahogany. And then once I had this section, you could see I'm just following my line. I'm going to have to do some cleanup with chisels on this. And then I didn't film the whole process, but I continued that curve cut down to the extension of that curve that's going to be created on here. And once again, just sending all of my pieces through. The most important thing initially is getting those angles right the first time so they'll sit on your piece properly. And then before I stop with the table saw, I'm cutting the angle on the top of this. This was the last thing I did. I probably should have done this a little bit earlier so it was a safer cut, but that is essentially what I'm left with once I'm done with the table saw. I just have the cove to cut and to clean up the tops. I'm testing it on my piece to make sure it will work, and then that is my finished stack. I'm going to show you how I do this last one. Now I just have this attached to the table with some double-sided tape. I marked the upper side of where that cove is, I marked the middle of where that cove is, and then obviously the bottom of that cove is marked by the top of the angle. So whenever I'm doing something like this, these lines are super important. Those are the ones that I'll follow. In order to clean up the tops, I basically just used a chisel. I enjoy chisel work. It's a little bit of a slower process, but for this it was an easy way to remove the ridges left over from the table saw and get this to follow my lines. So you can see on the curve, all I'm doing is just rounding over this bit. Everything's left square from the table saw, and I'm not even necessarily looking at that line as much as I'm following what I did previously, and then getting this down to where this curves over nicely without any of those striations left over from the table saw. And then I'm going to speed it up a little bit. I try and keep some stuff in real time so people can get an idea of how fast or slow the process is going to take, and then I'll speed things up. And then once I get to the top here, I could just use a small hand plane in order to clean up that curve. So pretty simple stuff. This was fast work. In order to create the cove, I was reviewing some of these carving discs for an angle grinder in the shop at the time. A lot of people, once again, in those shorts mentioned you can make these cove cuts on the table saw. I am well aware of that. I've done that before, but I don't have a cove cutting jig. So getting all the math accurate and lining everything up for cutting coves is quite time consuming if you've never done it before and you don't already have a jig. So it was really simple to just put this bit in my angle grinder, recreate that cove quite quickly, and then finish it up with a belt sander. So that's why I decided to do it this way. You can see the belt sander, the nose of it fits perfectly in that angle I created. I can go through and just follow it across, and then I could take my oscillating sander on the top and just feather all of those pieces together and create a nice seamless piece. You can see I'm following my line almost perfectly. I have a ton of extra, so the edges aren't perfect, but that's not really that big of a deal. And like I said, I just had this attached with some double-sided tape, and that is what that looks like. I can compare it to my piece. Now obviously when you're making custom pieces like this, when you go to put it together, there might be some undulations, but all of that can be easily fixed with some sanding. The installation of this will be in my normal Saturday morning video. And then I can compare it to the pieces I already cut, and you can see it lines up just about perfectly. So that's a great way to tell if these are going to be a nightmare to install or not. And that is my pile. This was about an afternoon's worth of work. Like I said, it wasn't something I could order, so I had to make it. I do kind of pride myself on making everything in the shop anyway, so it worked out. And like I said, I'm going to be showing the installation of this with the regular upload of the videos for this Adacule build. I decided to make this a singular video because it was essentially a subset of this build. It was a skill set of its own. I didn't want to make the Saturday's video 30 minutes long. So that is basically what that's going to look like when it is installed. Everything went together quite nicely. I was happy with how everything turned out on this one. My camera is attached to the piece, that's why it's shaking, an unfortunate mistake that I do sometimes make. And none of this is sanded, but these are just some finished photos of what all of that trim looks like attached.